Hello, book burners, and welcome to another episode of Books Are Burning. I'm your host, Mark Will, author, songwriter, and publisher in permanent exile, currently based on the island of Taiwan. Today, I will discuss the second half of Immanuel Kant's To Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch. In a previous episode, I discussed the first part of the book, and I'll include a link to that episode in the show notes. If you haven't listened to or watched the previous episode, I suggest you do that before you listen to or watch this episode. But if you don't have time to do that, stick around because this will be interesting in and of itself. So, let's begin with the second section of Immanuel Kant's To Perpetual Peace. You may remember that in the first section, Kant lists the preliminary articles for perpetual peace among nations. In the second section, he outlines the definitive articles for perpetual peace among nations. Now, before he does that, there's a brief introductory section which says, among other things, the natural state is one of war, which does not just consist in open hostilities, but also in the constant and enduring threat of them. Well, who does that sound like? It reminds me of Thomas Hobbes, who lived about a century before Kant, and is famous for having said that life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which is why he, in his famous work, Leviathan, advocated for a strong state to prevent mankind from, falling prey to its savage natural instincts. So Kant seems to have a similar view, but as we'll see, it's a bit less pessimistic than Hobbes's, I would say. And, we might have occasion to question this view in general. I mean, of course, Rousseau would argue that it's in the state of nature that we're most ourselves, and there are other more modern thinkers and authors who have uh, views that are similar to Rousseau's. I mean, they don't necessarily endorse his view of the noble savage, but they are certainly opposed to Hobbes's view and maybe Kant's as well. So, one other thing, as a consequence of this rather Hobbesian view, one other thing Kant mentions is the state of peace must therefore be established, which can only happen in a state of lawfulness. So the assumption is that we're not naturally inclined to live in a state of peace. The warlike state is our natural state, according to Kant. So I don't know. That's an important assumption to keep in mind. I'm not sure I accept it. Let me know what you think. Do you? Do you think we're naturally warlike and savage, or do you subscribe to a more, I don't know, a view more in line with that of Rousseau, who says that it's our natural state that is our ideal state, and it's the establishment of society that leads us astray and makes us more warlike, in fact. All right, so here we go. Kant's first definitive article for perpetual peace among nations. He says the civil constitution of every nation should be republican. Okay, so this is at the level of the individual in relation to the nation state, I guess you could say. He says government is either republican or despotic. And republicanism is that political principle whereby executive power, that is the government, is separated from legislative power. Under a non-republican constitution where subjects are not citizens, the easiest thing in the world to do is to declare war. So if you want to prevent war, then at the civil level, you need to have a republican government, because non-republican governments can easily declare war. All right, so this is interesting. He says democracy, in the proper sense of the term, is necessarily a despotism because it sets up an executive power in which all citizens make decisions about and, if need be, against one, meaning the executive, presumably, who therefore does not agree. Okay, so democracy, according to Kant, is not a republican form of government. What do you think about that? Or, well, even more than that, it is necessarily a despotism, right? So it's opposed to republicanism. There's not even any kind of tangential relationship between democracy and republicanism. Do you agree with that? I'm not sure. I was somewhat surprised by this statement, but maybe I shouldn't have been, because, of course, patriotically, he declares that the ideal, nation state was the Prussian empire, I guess, presided over by his ideal executive, Frederick the Great, who reportedly said, "I am merely the nation's highest servant." So it seems that Kant considers, the Prussian um, government empire to be the ideal type of government to prevent war. Did that happen? I actually don't know the history of Prussia at all, and in particular under Frederick the Great. So I would have to look into that further. Maybe maybe you can tell me. Um, but this is the ideal at the civil level, and again, this is looking at the relation of the individual to the nation state, basically, which leads us to uh, definitive article number 2: the right of nations shall be based on a federation of free states. So here we progress to the international level. So just as the individual must enter into a kind of social contract with the nation state, um, and like willingly subject himself or herself to the laws of the nation state to in order to maintain peace, nations need to um, you know abide by a kind of implied international law. And so, in particular, he suggests that there be some kind of league of peace. And he always gives the Latin um, phrase for these terms he uses in German originally. Of course, I'm reading an English translation, but a foedus pacificum, a league of peace. So, he, in a way, he might be one of the inspirations for Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, right? Founded after World War One with the aim, well, at least the official aim, of preventing another world war. And, well, how did that turn out? There was another world war, of course, a second world war after the first. So the League of Nations was a failure. And then, one of his successors, FDR, founded the um, United Nations after World War II. And whatever you might say about it, and I won't here, enter into a discussion about the pros and cons of the UN. Certainly, it's a very flawed organization, but if one of its aims is to prevent the outbreak of World War III, so far as of today, April 22nd, 2024, as I film this, uh, it has succeeded. Although some say that we're now in the midst of World War III. World War III has already begun. What with certain events occurring in Ukraine and Israel, Palestine, and various other places. So maybe it hasn't been successful in that sense. But this is what Kant recommends: a League of Peace, some kind of international body which nations should voluntarily submit to, just as the individual submits to the laws of the nation state. That's how I understand it. And he says reason can provide related nations with no other means for emerging from the state of lawlessness, which consists solely of war, than that they give up their savage, lawless freedom, just as individual persons do. Okay, that's pretty much what I said. So just at the civil level, the individual gives up his or her rights and agrees to follow the laws, to not be at the mercy of his or her, savage nature. Nations must do the same at the international level, right? Otherwise, it's endless war. So if you want peace, you must submit to international law of some sort, he seems to say. Nations must be constrained just like individuals. All right, which leads us to the third definitive article, which is, I guess, a kind of outgrowth of the second, but let me just read it here. Cosmopolitan right shall be limited to conditions of universal hospitality. So this seems to be a kind of extension of international law, but it's cosmopolitan because, there are some parts of the globe that are like not under the direct jurisdiction of nation states. I mean, maybe now every square inch of the earth is like accounted for, like some nation state claims it, but there are disputes. I mean, there's certain islands and certain regions of the sea and so forth that are disputed. So in these areas, we, according to Kant, need to recognize this principle of universal hospitality. And I like this very much. He says, or he mentions the right of an alien not to be treated as an enemy upon his arrival in another's country. And as an international traveler myself, I like this. I mean, I think we should be free to travel everywhere, and wherever we go, we should not be viewed as enemies. But, at the same time, he points out we can't insist that we have the same rights as people who are native born to that nation state, and we can't insist that we be permitted to stay forever and have full rights of citizenship. Of course, he understands that, of course, as long as we have nation states, I mean, he doesn't say this, but it's certainly implied that as long as we have nation states, there will be border control and visas and that kind of thing. So he's not saying we do away with those regulations and we have open borders and anyone can just like be a citizen of any country whatsoever. But visitors should not be treated as enemies, right? Like aliens should be allowed to visit. And again, this is an extension of international law, which he calls cosmopolitan right. And as I say, I like this. This is good. So he elaborates on that. He says, the right to visit, to associate, belongs to all men by virtue of their common ownership of the earth's surface. And again, I'm glad he recognizes this, right? Like before there were nation states, we all owned in common the Earth's surface, every square inch of the Earth. Like, why should any one person or group of people think they have any more claim to it than anyone else? Like, we all have common ownership of the Earth's surface at some fundamental level. And continuing, he says, for since the Earth is a globe, they cannot scatter themselves infinitely, but must finally tolerate living in close proximity, because originally, remember, no one had a greater right to any region of the Earth than anyone else. I'm glad he recognizes that. And I wonder if Hobbes says the same thing. I haven't actually read Leviathan in its entirety, and I'm not sure I want to, but I don't know what he would say about that. Certainly, that in this passage here, he sounds a bit like Rousseau. All right, so he condemns the inhospitableness of certain peoples. So on the high seas, you've got the Barbary Coast pirates, right? Like, they're not recognizing this cosmopolitan right that people have by attacking people on the seas and engaging in piratical activities. That's not very hospitable. And then in the deserts, you've got what he calls the Arabic Bedouins, right? So the pirates and the marauders, they're not being hospitable. They're inhospitable, and so they're not upholding this cosmopolitan right. And again, the high seas and the deserts, these are like disputed territories, right? They're not necessarily part of specific nation states, or they're like not clearly recognized as such. They're kind of in a no man's land, as it were. So when we're in these sketchy regions or areas, Kant seems to suggest there should be cosmopolitan right and hospitable, friendly, mutually friendly behavior. And again, this is an extension of international right. This, I would say, this section of this part of the book, the second half of the book, is the most interesting, maybe the most interesting of the entire book, to me personally. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Now, lest you think he only condemns the so-called savage nations, right? He also criticizes certain so-called civilized nations. He says the inhospitable conduct of civilized nations in our part of the world, meaning Europe, of course, especially commercial ones, is, not to be admired. And of course, as we saw in the previous episode, he has a particular dislike of Great Britain, the UK, as it's now called, England, as it may have been known to him. And he, in particular, he cites the behavior of the British Empire in India and the way it treated its colonial subjects. Not very hospitable. Okay. And then there's an interesting phrase describing powers who, while imbibing injustice like water, make much of their piety, and who in matters of orthodoxy want to be regarded as the elect. Well, he wrote this in the late 18th century, just after the founding of the United States. I don't know if he predicted it at the time, but I imagine he would be rather surprised and appalled at what that former colonial outpost became. The United States of today seems to fit this description. Powers who, let me read it again, powers who, while imbibing injustice like water, make much of their piety. The city on the hill, yeah, and who in matters of orthodoxy want to be regarded as the elect. Oh yes, the U.S. is the singular nation, right? And who else does it remind you of? Well, reminds me of a certain Middle Eastern ethno-state called Israel. The most moral country and army in the world. All right, so uh, somewhat in contrast to these inhospitable entities or nation states or groups of people, tribes maybe that he discusses, he mentions China and Japan, which have had experience with such guests, meaning these colonists. And he says they have therefore wisely restricted contact with them. So they still do trade, but he talks about how, like, the Dutch are kept away from, you know, uh, the natives. Their interactions with the natives are restricted, lest, uh, China and Japan become like, I don't know, India or some of those other colonial outpost colonies that are like completely dominated by these, let's face it, mostly Western powers. So um, I don't know. I guess he would say they're still hospitable because they allow visitation and trade, but they restrict. And he says wisely, they restrict contact with their native populations. Again, he's talking about China and Japan in the 18th century. So he seems to endorse this behavior. Like, you've got to have strict uh, controls. Like, you should practice hospitality, be welcoming to visitors, not treat them as enemies so much. But you can certainly have strict guidelines governing their behavior in your particular nation state. Now, as one who has lived in Asia for many years, I don't know. Sometimes this, of course, it's quite a different thing now, 2, 3 centuries later. It's different from the, you know, 18th century, but some of these xenophobic views still prevail, let's say, or are still prevalent. You know, again, it's opened up since the 18th century, but there's like a, I don't know, an atavistic or ancestrally transmitted xenophobia, which is still at play among some in East Asia, in particular. I would say that's just the way it is. I mean, take it or leave it. All right, I'm babbling now, so let's carry on. Very interesting footnote. I mean, this is, I have to say, there's in addition to like all the political discussion of War and Peace and so on, there's some interesting anthropological information in this second section of the book. So, in a footnote, and this is like a footnote to his mention of China, he says, this is a very interesting excursus. He says the Roman so-called land of Ceres was China, and silk was brought from there to Europe across Greater Tibet. Now, those of you watching can see this map of the Silk Road, part of which may have run, like one of the routes may have run through Tibet. And so Kant seems to assume that, it ran through Greater Tibet. So China's connection to Europe and the Middle East as well, I guess, was facilitated by Tibet. Like, so these caravans went through Tibet. So the nexus connecting China and these more Western nations was Tibet, which he claims. This is interesting, fascinating. from the anthropologist's point of view. He says, perhaps this also allows us to clarify the very ancient but never properly understood commerce of Europe with Tibet from what Hezekias has recorded about the Hierophant's cry, Konks Ompax, in the Eleusinian Mysteries. So at Eleusis in Greece, uh, there, of course, there was a mystery cult, right? And the Hierophant, or the priest, or I don't know, maybe one of the worshippers or followers of the cult would chant this cry of Konks Ompax, and it's not Greek. No one has really understood what it meant to this day. I don't think it's definitively agreed upon, like what it meant, but it's kind of like a magical phrase, a kind of abracadabra or hocus pocus or something like that. Konks Ompax. But according to Kant, and using some rather dubious etymologies, which he found in a French dictionary of the Tibetan language. Here's what he says. Thus, that mysterious term Kongs Ompax might well refer to that holy Kongs, blessed Om, and wise Pax, supreme being who pervades the world, nature personified. So, and these are translations of words from Tibetan, according to this dictionary that he consulted. Now, again, they look a little bit sketchy to me, but wow, quite an interesting theory that in Greece, in Eleusis, this phrase chanted, this mysterious phrase chanted in the mystery religion, which prevailed there, this phrase had its origin in Tibet. Imagine if that were true. Anyway, this slide, if you're watching, features a graphic from Aleister Crowley's book, Konks Ompax. And apparently, according to Wikipedia, that very reliable source, the graphic was designed by Crowley himself while under the influence of hashish. I jest somewhat. I think for this kind of thing, like Wikipedia probably is pretty reliable, but if you trust Wikipedia as a source for current political news and controversial topics like the assassination of JFK and so on, well, you may want to reconsider. All right, let's move on. So this is interesting. This is a great phrase, one of my favorites in the book. Kant says, a transgression of rights in one place in the world is felt everywhere. Great line. A transgression of rights in one place in the world is felt everywhere. That's true. Consequently, the idea of cosmopolitan right is not fantastic and exaggerated, but rather an amendment to the unwritten code of national and international rights. So, again, we had national or civil, international, and now cosmopolitan, which he calls an amendment, or it's kind of an outgrowth of those others. So, again, remember that phrase: the transgression of rights in one place in the world is felt everywhere. Beautiful, eloquent. All right, so those were the three definitive articles for perpetual peace among nations. But of course, he can't stop there. He also has to have some supplements and appendices. So we begin here with the first supplement on the guarantee of perpetual peace. So what's that? According to Kant, perpetual peace is ensured, guaranteed by nothing less than that great artist, nature. So, somewhat paradoxically, we're savage, warlike, lawless by nature, but it is nature itself which ensures perpetual peace. Well, how is that? He explains. Nature's provisional arrangement consists of the following. 1. She is taking care that men can live in all regions of the world. Think of all the different climates and landscapes in which mankind has flourished, right? From the coldest Arctic regions to the hottest tropical and subtropical regions, I guess. Um, so that's due to nature, right? Like nature, has taken care that men can live in all regions of the world. Like mankind can adapt to pretty much any place on the globe, with some exceptions, of course. But then he says, 2, through war, she has driven them everywhere, even into the most inhospitable regions, in order to populate them. That I'm not sure I can completely accept. Like, the only reason for migration is war? Like, what about, didn't some hunter gatherer peoples migrate seasonally, or when there was no longer game in a certain region, or maybe they just got bored and they they wanted to go elsewhere? Like, is it always war that drives men throughout the regions of the world? I don't know, somewhat questionable, but that's his assumption. And then number 3 says, also through war, she has constrained them to establish more or less legal relationships. Now, this is the maybe the most important of the 3. So, like, the nature of mankind is warlike, savage, lawless. Okay. And then there's war. And so people spread out all over the earth. But then they eventually realize it's in their best interest to have some kind of legal agreements to prevent war. So it's nature that leads mankind to behave in a way that is paradoxically against its own nature, if I'm understanding him correctly. All right. And then again, more interesting anthropological issue. He says the transition from the lawless freedom of hunting, and we'll come back to this because this is, I would say, somewhat controversial. But he says the transition from the lawless freedom of hunting, fishing, and herding to the life of agriculture. I'm quoting this out of context, but he refers to the transition from the lawless freedom of hunting, fishing, and herding to the life of agriculture, right? And he says salt and iron were discovered next, and these were probably the first articles of trade sought far and wide by different peoples. In this way, they entered into peaceful relations with one another, and from this common understanding, community of interest and peaceful relations arose with the most distant peoples. So again, this is how, mankind dealt with its warlike, savage, lawless nature. It was trade. Well, first of all, like, he argues that hunting, fishing, and herding is more like savage and warlike than the life of agriculture, which is, it discourages migration. People have to settle so they can tend their fields and crops and so on. And then with the discovery of salt and iron, trade developed. And so people understood that, like, instead of giving into their warlike natural impulses, again, according to this theory, it's better to have some kind of law so that there can be peaceful relations, right? Like, if you kill neighboring peoples, you can't trade with them. So, again, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. Do I accept that completely? Like, does that make sense? Our savage nature ultimately had to be resisted, but that too was done naturally. Okay. And then there's a footnote to this mention of the transition from hunting, fishing, and herding to agriculture. And this I think is quite debatable, but this is Kant's view, so I'm just sharing it with you. Take it or leave it. He says in a footnote, of all forms of life, the life of the hunter is without doubt most contrary to a civilized constitution. For having to live separately, families soon become estranged and, dispersed as they become in immense forest also soon become enemies. All right, so all these hunters start fighting one another. And he says the Noachic prohibition against blood, and related to that is the eating of raw flesh, appears originally to have been nothing other than a command against the hunting life. All right, so let's back up a bit, right? If you know your biblical mythology, we have the story of Cain and Abel, right? So Cain and Abel, sons of Adam and Eve. Cain's sacrifice to God, to the Lord, Yahweh, or whoever, was looked upon less favorably than that of his brother Abel, right? And Cain was the agriculturalist. Abel was the herdsman, right? He herded cattle. So at that time, God, the God of the Hebrews, seemed to have a preference for. I mean, if you interpret that myth allegorically, it seems to be saying that, you know, hey, being a herdsman is better than being a farmer, right? Being an agriculturalist. So I don't know. It's almost like uh, what the Kantian would consider the savage nature. So the God of the Hebrews seemed to prefer at that time of the Old Testament, right? Like the sons of Adam and Eve. But then after God punishes mankind and destroys most of mankind in his flood, there's like a reversal of that according to Kant's interpretation. It's like, no, actually, all of that was bad. Okay, so the Noachic prohibition against blood and eating of raw flesh seems to be a reversal of that previous view, right? Like at that time, the agriculturalist was looked upon less favorably than the herdsman, and then I guess by extension the huntsman, the hunter, and the fisherman, right? So what are we to understand by this? God ultimately decided that actually the hunter and the fisherman and the herdsman is too savage and too warlike. So it's better that we promote agriculturalism. Is that how we're to interpret these biblical myths? In the beginning, we had the preference for the life of the hunter-gatherer, but then God becomes disgusted with these savage warlike peoples, destroys them all in a flood with a few exceptions, and then says, all right, forget it, stop with your hunting and gathering and become agriculturalists. Is that how are these myths like allegories of the transition from the hunter-gatherer's life to the agriculturalist life? I don't know. Seems likely, but it's clear which side Kant is on, right? Like he definitely um, suggests that that agriculture was the correct way to go, right? Like transitioning from the life of the hunter gatherer to that of the agriculturalist was historically correct, and this is very controversial to this day. I mean, I've got two books on my bookshelves at this very moment which have a different view. So in Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress, Christopher Ryan argues that, the hunter gatherers may have had it right. Like they had better lives than we do. And what's the price of our civilization? He looks at the discontents of civilization as Freud would have it. And then Marshall Solins in his Stone Age Economics argues essentially the same thing. Now, of these two works, I would definitely recommend Civilized to Death, but Stone Age Economics less so. I mean, it took me a while to get through that. Some of it was quite boring, to be honest, but both ask us to reconsider our thoughts about the hunter gatherers and to question the value of our so-called civilization, as Baudelaire called it. And, this also reminds me of Jared Diamond, the scholar who I've not read any of his books, but I know that he said something like agriculture was the single greatest mistake in the history of humanity. It was a total disaster because with agriculture, you get hierarchies, right? You have social levels. You've got workers, you've got a kind of middle group, and then you've got like elites. And maybe there's one elite among the elites at the top, right? And then you've got standing armies, you've got war. I mean, in a sense, they're arguing for something quite different from what Kant and Hobbes seem to be arguing. That, in fact, it was the rise of nations and settled communities which led to war. Before that, in the hunter-gatherer era, yeah, there may have been some conflicts, but for the most part, people just kind of did their own thing. It was when you had people organized into settled societies with, grain to be grown or crops to be grown and then stored and then protected from other peoples. That's when all the warlike behavior actually developed. So I don't know. That makes sense to me in a way, but I'm just now realizing that there may be a fundamental disconnect or disagreement between this view and that of Hobbes and Kant. But whatever the case, we're still, our current world is certainly one of nation states. So if we want to have peace, given that reality, I think we can still benefit from Kant's views. But as far as what was the correct way to go historically, I don't know. I'm not sure I agree with Kant on those points. All right. So again, here we go with the second supplement, and he calls this a secret article for Perpetual Peace. He says there's a secret article in Proceedings concerning public right, and he says this is a contradiction. But he says the maxims of philosophers concerning the conditions under which public peace is possible shall be consulted by nations armed for war. That kings should be philosophers or philosophers' kings is neither to be expected nor to be desired, for the possession of power inevitably corrupts reason's free judgment. And if you're watching, you can see this picture of Marcus Aurelius, the so-called philosopher king. Would he agree to this? So, this is the secret. Let me back up to this previous slide. A secret article in Proceedings concerning public right is a contradiction. So, he explains why this is the case a bit later, but basically the idea is that it violates the principle of publicity, and anything that any policy, for example, that violates the principle of publicity is, by its very nature, opposed to the public right. Like, there must be transparency in order for public right not to be violated. But the secret is that people in power consult philosophers. So he says that's a good thing, and he seems to argue that there should be this distinction between philosophers and politicians. And when those two qualities are combined in one person, there's going to be corruption. Is that necessarily true? I don't know. Maybe Marcus Aurelius is an exception to that, or maybe he isn't. At some point, might be good to do an episode on Marcus Aurelius's meditations, but we'll save that for another day. All right, then there's an appendix, the first part of which is on the disagreement between morals and politics in relation to perpetual peace. So he's got this passage. Politics says, "Be ye wise as serpents." Politics says that, to which morality adds as a limiting condition, "and innocent as doves." So again, that's a paradoxical statement. He says the proposition honesty is the best policy is beyond all refutation and is the indispensable condition of all policy. So again, this is that principle of publicity that I alluded to before, doctrine of publicity. If you're hiding shit, then it can't be a good policy. There must be transparency. If you have to lie for your policy to be successful, it's probably not a good one. Well, let's apply that to today's geopolitical situation. I mean, do we believe anything that we're being told by our so-called leaders? It's one lie after another, isn't it? So, it's impossible that their policies can be good because there's no transparency. They're lying all the time. So they're violating public right at every turn. So again, from the Kantian view, there's no way this can lead to perpetual peace, which I think is instructive. All right, then he says, I can actually think of a moral politician, that is, one who so interprets the principles of political prudence that they can be coherent with morality. But I cannot think of a political moralist, that is, one who forges a morality to suit the statesman's advantage. All right, so did you get that distinction? Moral politician, that's possible, but political moralist, no. So I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. Is it possible for there to be a moral politician? Who are our moral politicians today? I mean, who stands on principle? You have to ask, if they're really moral people, why did they want to become politicians, which they would have to know on some level. They would have to know that the current political landscape is completely corrupt. So what would motivate them to go into politics? It's been observed by some that, only psychopaths would be interested in becoming politicians. But I don't know. Are there any, if Marcus Aurelius is an exception, are there any Marcus Aureliuses? That wouldn't be the Latin plural, would it? Are there any Marci Aurelii in the world today? I'm skeptical. All right, so he says the political moralists, is that what he calls them? Yeah, these so-called political moralists always engage in the following sophistries. Number one, fac et excusa. So I'll translate the Latin for you. It means do and excuse. In other words, just do whatever you want and then justify it after the fact. Number two, si fecisti, nega. So if you have done something, deny it. And number 3, divide et impera, divide and rule, divide and conquer. Right? So these are strategies that the political moralists, so-called, use all the time. In other words, fucking liars. No transparency, certainly they violate the doctrine of publicity at every turn. So they do things and then they make excuses. They do things and then they deny that they've done things. I mean, for this, si fecisti nega, if you've done something, deny it. Well, I just can't help thinking about the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline, right? And then 3, divide et impera, divide and conquer. So division, I mean, this is done internationally. I'm thinking about the U.S. government in particular at this point, maybe because I'm a U.S. passport holder, but, look at the ways they're sowing division on the home front, right? In the so-called homeland, the Heimatstadt. You've got people divided over culture war issues, right? So the elites can steal all the money while the peasants are arguing about stupid shit like bathrooms and so on. All right. Towards the end, he says, all politics, I think this is kind of like a coda to the entire book, or to this last section. All politics must bend its knee before morality, and by doing so, it can hope to reach, though but gradually, the stage where it will shine in light perpetual. All politics must bend its knee before morality. How far away are we from that today? So again, these are like preconditions for peace. Like, how are you going to have peace without morality? And how are you going to have a moral system without transparency and honesty and, concern for civil right, international right, and cosmopolitan right? It's going to be impossible. And I think he's right on these points, whether you agree with him about the origin of so-called civilization and nation states, and whether agriculture is preferable to, the hunter-gatherer's lifestyle. Again, I think given our current reality, which consists of nation states, let's face it, whether we like them or not, whether we consider ourselves to be more cosmopolitan citizens of the world or whatever, this is the reality. There are nation states. We do have passports. There are border controls and so on. That's a reality. So given that reality, what's the best way to avoid war? Wouldn't that be a good thing? Perpetual peace. And frankly, looking at the current situation, I don't think we're doing too well. We're very far from applying these principles that he claims are necessary. All right, so then there's a final appendix. Number 2, on the agreement between politics and morality under the transcendental concept of public right. Again, remember, Kant is an Enlightenment philosopher, so some of this it's pretty deep into the philosophy, and he's applying his own philosophical principles to this question of perpetual peace among nations. So he cites what he calls a transcendental formula of public right. He says, which he describes as, all actions that affect the rights of other men are wrong if their maximum is not consistent with publicity. So this doctrine of publicity, this principle of publicity, which is kind of principle of transparency. If at one point he says, like, if you are afraid for other people to know what you're actually doing or what your true motives are, then you're morally in the wrong and you're not behaving in a way that's consistent with morality. Um, so he saves the this doctrine of publicity is mentioned in the translator's introduction to the version of the text that I read in English. But it's actually saved for this final. It's not made explicit until this final appendix, like at the very end of the book. Although it's alluded to before that. All right, and then put another way, he says all maxims that require publicity in order not to fail of their end agree with both politics and morality. So the best policies are those that require publicity. I guess I understood this as meaning like you have to get the public on board with your policy or it's not going to be successful. And so you have to clearly explain what the policy is. You have to make sure that there's consensus, and only then will it be successful, and only then will you prevent war and maintain a state of perpetual peace. And then finally, he elaborates saying, for if they can achieve their end only through publicity, they must also conform to the universal public end, which he defines as happiness. And it is the singular task of politics to establish this, that is, to make the public satisfied with its state. Wow, how far is that from our current reality? I mean, um, again, since I'm a citizen of the U.S., although I haven't lived there in many years, I see what's going on. But I mean, you tell me if you live there. Uh, do you think that is the goal of our so-called leaders? Universal public happiness? Is that what they're trying to achieve? Um, they're trying to make the public satisfied with its state. What do you think? Look at your congresspeople, your senators, your presidents, or your preferred presidential candidates. Is this their goal? Universal public happiness, universal public satisfaction with the state. Come on. We know that's not the case. Well, what do we do about it? I mean, that, I don't know, but think about this in Kantian terms. Just ask yourself whether we're anywhere close to that now. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Can we learn something from Kant? All right. So as I was reading this, I heard about another related book, which I might read at some point. Let me know if you'd like me to discuss this. It's called An Inquiry into the Nature of Peace by Thorstein Veblen, who is an American economist. I heard about this in I think it was an interview with Peter Joseph, the Zeitgeist guy. He was in conversation with Abby Martin, if I remember correctly, and he mentioned this. Sounded interesting. Maybe worth reading. An Inquiry into the Nature of Peace, Thorstein Veblen. I don't know. Does he adopt Kantian principles? I'm not sure if there was any influence there. I'd be curious to learn more about this. So I might save that for another episode at some point in the future. There's some other books that I've got piled up over here that I want to talk with you about. So that'll probably come first, but maybe some point that'd be worth discussing. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Be sure to like, share, subscribe if you haven't. you can follow me on Substack. Subscribe to my newsletter there. It's Mark Will Write, WRITE.substack.com. And subscribe on YouTube too. My YouTube channel is at Mark Will Write, WRITE. All right, so I think that's it for now. This concludes my discussion of Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace. See you next time. Bye-bye.